Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Greek Centre. Allow me to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to our elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to tonight's seminar/exhibition launch entitled From Imbros Over the Sea, Imbros and Gallipoli Revealed by Jim Claven. But first, let me go into some housekeeping items. Firstly, next week's seminar is from Melbourne-based ACU academic Dr. Nick Trakakis, who will be speaking on the writings and poetry of Tassos Livadidis, and it will take place here at the mezzanine level at sort of 7 p.m. During the following month of June, all the seminars will be online, as we have mainly international speakers. And in July, most of the seminars there will be associated with the 50th anniversary of the invasion of Cyprus. That will be the common theme. And then in August, we return back to the mezzanine. Also on Saturday, the 1st of June, at Melbourne's Recital Centre, there's the Actionisti concert, the Dimitris Bassis. From what I know, there's still a handful of tickets left, so go online if you haven't done so. There's still a few tickets remaining. It will get sold out. Thursday, so coming back to today's seminar with Jim Claven, as I said, it's both a presentation but also a photographic exhibition, and the exhibition will be here till the end of the week. It's only part of the exhibition is on show tonight, but the full exhibition will be on show over the weekend. I don't think there's any great authority on Gallipoli and the Gallipoli campaign, especially with the respect of involvement of the Greek populated islands of Limnos and Imbros at the time. There's probably no greater authority than sort of Jim Claven. He's published a lot and researched a lot in that area. And it's great that tonight's seminar is also being enhanced by this photo exhibition as well. With respect to tonight's seminar, I would like to thank our sponsors, Peter Battistea on behalf of AHEPA Victoria, and also the Imbrian Society of Melbourne, who've contributed much to this exhibition as well. However, to introduce both the speaker and give some background on the topic, I'd like to invite someone who's a bit more knowledgeable than me on this area, George Xinos from Imbrian Society, to the podium. George, give him a round of applause while he climbs those steps. And got there. We do have public liability insurance.
Don't let anybody tell you that over 45 soccer is a good idea. Good evening, and thank you, Nick, for the opportunity to introduce our speaker tonight. Before doing so, however, on behalf of the Imbrian Society of Melbourne, I'd like to extend our gratitude to you, Nick, and the Greek community of Melbourne for including today's presentation in the History and Culture Seminar Series, as well as your generosity for allowing us to show the exhibition this coming weekend. The Society would also like to take the opportunity to thank the organisations and the individuals who have lent their financial support to the exhibition. These include the Victorian Government and Victorian Veterans Council, the Kingston City Council, Functional Access Solutions, Rose Martinez Dalama, Konstantatelos, Kay Lafiati, Theo Kalinderidis, Arthur Ipsaros, Arthur Xinos, and Zinovia Simoglu. Without the support of these people and organisations, the exhibition could not have been realised. From our perspective, it's always a very exciting and proud day when we get to share our stories and images of our ancestors home to a broader audience. Through this project, for the first time, our islands and our community's connection to Australia's Anzac story is being told. For those of us whose heritage connects us to the island, the exhibition reveals Imbros in a new light, from a new perspective. It captures Imbros from the view of the young photographers and writers who came over 100 years ago as sailors, as soldiers, and as airmen. Yes, they document the life of the military base, the ships that anchor in the harbour, the soldiers in the camps, the graves in the cemeteries. but they also reveal our island in its life. They show the people in the villages. We see children in the villages and towns, locals guiding the new visitors on their donkeys. We see some of the religious life of the people, and we see some of the physical remains of the history of the island in the great castle in Castro. For the veterans' descendants, the exhibition depicts the world of their relatives as they experience the Greek island. An island of respite from the horrors of war that they endured on the battlefield of the peninsula. And for those without such connections, the exhibition reveals the Gallipoli story and Australia's part in it through a new light, the light of our island. An island that the famous Australian war correspondent and historian Charles Bean described as being bathed in a velvet glow. For these reasons, the exhibition is an important one for us. Many months ago, we decided to approach tonight's presenter, Jim Claven, and embark together on this journey of discovery. We knew of Jim's great work in telling the story of Lemnos and its part in the Gallipoli campaign. We also knew that he had travelled to Imbros to complement his archival research by walking in the footsteps of the Anzacs back in 1915 and 1916. The exhibition and the accompanying guide is a reflection of Jim's decades-long research into Imbros' role in Gallipoli. For this, our small community will be eternally grateful to him. His dedication to the project, his commitment to the historical sources, and his desire to create an exhibition that we can be proud of will be in evidence tonight through the presentation, but of course also in the exhibition that will be available for you to see this weekend. We could not have wished for a better person to create this exhibition, a true Philhellene and a tremendous contributor to the Greek-Australian community. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Jim Claven.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, George, for those kind words. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. Many of you will know of my research into the role of Lemnos in the Gallipoli campaign. Tonight I will talk of another island, often overlooked, which played a significant part in that campaign, the northern Aegean Island of Imbros. My presentation will explain the role of Imbros in the campaign, as well as the impact of the campaign on the island and its people, drawing on both my research into the archives, both here and overseas, as well as my field research on Imbros itself. They'll also provide some background to the pictorial exhibition which I prepared on behalf of Melbourne's Imbrian Society, some of which is displayed here, with the whole exhibition to be displayed here over the weekend. The Gallipoli campaign brought over 1 million service personnel on both sides of the war to the Gallipoli Peninsula, the waters of the Dardanelles and the islands of the northern Aegean, especially Lemnos, Imbros and Tenedos. Hundreds of ships, battleships, submarines, civilian vessels, large and small, brought into military service would plough the seas. The new technology of flight would be brought to the region, with airplanes, balloons and airships reaching across the sky in support of those in the trenches and those at sea. This war machine would transform the region. It would see the Ottoman defenders remove the overwhelmingly Greek population of the Gallipoli Peninsula and the area transformed with trenches, hospitals and supply bases. But no less significant was the transformation of the nearby islands and the surrounding waters as the Allied forces, as I will call the nations of the Entente Cordiale, opposing the Central Powers, prepared for and sustained their assault on the peninsula. Operating 650 miles and 2 days sailing from their base in Alexandria in Egypt, or over 1,600 miles from the British naval base at Malta, the Allies needed to establish bases nearer the battlefront. The liberation by Greece of the northern Aegean islands of Lemnos, Imbros and Tenedos in 1912 and their proximity to the peninsula brought these islands and their people into the war. Each was to a greater or lesser extent involved in the campaign, an involvement which I believe was essential to the campaign itself. In many respects can be argued that without the involvement of these islands, there may well have been no Gallipoli campaign. The Greek government of Venizelos, eager to join the Allies, offered Lemnos as a base for the looming campaign. While his offer of Greek troops was rejected on the insistence of Russia, Lemnos, with its large protected harbour, was accepted as the major forward base for the campaign. Soon the Allies had decided to occupy both Imbros and Tenedos, given their closer proximity to the peninsula and ability to offer close support to the battlefronts. Political upheavals in Greece would see Venizelos fall from power and Greece adopt a neutral, some would argue pro-German, policy for most of the rest of the war, only rejoining the Allies with the return of Venizelos to power in 1917, Greece then going on to play a major part in the Salonika campaign across northern Greece. It should not be forgotten that hundreds of individual Hellenes sought to serve in the Allied cause at Gallipoli, whether as guides and interpreters on the peninsula itself, as crews on some of the Allied vessels that supported the troops at the front, or as soldiers serving in the special units created by the French forces at Gallipoli. The latter would serve alongside those Australians of Greek heritage who served with the Anzacs, including Private Peter Rados, the former Sydney resident from Ataki on the shores of the Bosphorus, who was killed at Gallipoli. Prior to the Gallipoli campaign, Imbros was an island on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire. It had been occupied by the Ottomans for nearly 500 years, yet its overwhelmingly Greek character had been preserved. Its Hellenic history can be traced through the writings of Homer and Herodotus and can be seen in the ancient sarcophagi that remain on the island. By 1915, Byzantine rule could be seen in the remains of its castles and in the Greek Orthodox faith of the vast majority of its people. Pre-war Ottoman census figures and the wartime accounts of Australian soldiers attest to the overwhelmingly Greek population of the island during the campaign. The impact of Gallipoli on Imbros began with the arrival of Allied warships to its surrounding waters in February 1915 as they assembled to take part in the initial bombardment of the Ottoman forts in the peninsula. On board one of these warships was the British commander of the Anzac Corps, Lieutenant General Birdwood, who would be the first Australian soldier to come to Imbros, his warship anchoring in a leaky bay. It was in the darkness of the night of the 24th, 25th of April that the waters off Imbros welcomed the Anzac troops as they rendezvoused before their final voyage to the beaches of Anzac. An Australian who witnessed this moment, their war correspondent Charles Bean, remarked on the high velvet hills of the island as his ship passed its northern coast. The island would continue to have a major naval role throughout the campaign and beyond. Its waters provided safe anchorage, especially at Kephalos Bay, but also at a leaky bay on its southern coast, for the hundreds of Allied warships and other vessels that took part in the campaign. Kephalos Bay's proximity to the fronts at Gallipoli ensured that it became a harbour for all manner of vessels, plying the waters between the peninsula and Imbros. Some transported men and supplies, others the wounded and sick. Warships ventured towards the coast to shell the Ottoman positions, others launched aircraft in support of the troops. The Allied headquarters for the campaign were initially based on ships anchored in Kephalos. Allied ships' logs confirmed the large number of vessels that came and went from Imbros during the campaign. Many of these ships brought hundreds of men to Imbros, whether as naval crew or as troops in transit. The great British warship, HMS Agamemnon, aboard which the Ottoman Empire would sign the armistice at Lemnos' Mudros Bay in October 1918, brought a crew of over 800 men to Imbros. Kephalos Bay became a hive of activity, with a leaky bay a secondary anchorage. The scene was captured in many photographs in the time and in the writings of some of the soldiers who were packed aboard the troop ships anchored there. In May, the 26-year-old Sydney-born Private Henry Gissing of the Australian 1st Field Ambulance would write of Kephalos as, quote, a bay containing several battleships and transports. Perhaps the most unusual connection to Australia was the arrival of the former Governor of Victoria, the 79-year-old Lord Brassey, and his suffragette wife aboard their private steam yacht, which he had converted into a medical carrier as an offering to Allied forces. The Allied decision to use Imbros as a forward base for the campaign would see it transformed into a major military and naval base. Although the Allies would make their presence felt across the island, their major camps and facilities would be concentrated on the southeastern corner of Imbros, in the region surrounding Kephalos Bay, its hinterland and the southern anchorage of Aliki Bay. Cephalus Bay saw the erection of anti-submarine nets, stone piers and navigational beacons. Ships were sunk at its entrance to act as a breakwater to protect the bay from the strong currents and winds from the north. The great storm that struck Cephalus Bay in late November, battering the ships anchored in the harbour, underscored the need for such preparatory action. One of the few close-up photographs of the new piers is this one taken by 38-year-old Australian Lieutenant Arthur Ross, a former public servant from South Yarra, during his time in Imbros, serving with General Birdwood's Anzac headquarters. The 16th Battalion 2nd Lieutenant Theodore Taylor, a 20-year-old clerk from Kalgoorlie, described the transformation when the battalion arrived at Cephalus Bay on the 6th of July for a short period of rest from the front. Writing in his battalion war diary of their transport passing the lighthouse at Cape Cephalus with its red light, then the protective boom identified by 2 red-painted boats and the harbour filled with Allied ships. Special cable-laying vessels came to Imbros to lay and maintain the telegraphic communications connecting the fronts at Gallipoli with the various Allied military and naval establishments on Imbros, Lemnos and Tenedos and beyond. This was done by 2 civilian cable-laying vessels pressed into naval service, known as the Levant 1 and the Levant 2. The latter coming to Imbros for no less than 50 days between May and January 1916. Many of her crew were Hellenes, recruited from the ports across the Mediterranean as well as nearby Tenedos. Soon the shoreline and ground around the bay were dotted with tented camps, joined by roadworks and tracks. The photograph reproduced here captures the expanse of the Allied encampment around Cephalus Bay and its hinterland. Store depots, bakeries, regimental canteens and other camps were located here, with access to the piers where goods could be loaded and unloaded. To these would be added medical facilities, aerodromes, airship hangars, as well as large military camps, spreading the base area beyond the shoreline into the surrounding valleys. These would cater for the troop reinforcements arriving on Imbros headed for the peninsula, as well as those returning for short periods of rest. Most importantly, the shores of Cephalus Bay would be the site of the Allied military headquarters of the whole campaign. These were moved ashore in May and remained on Imbros for the rest of the campaign. It was from here that the first Allied commander, Sir Ian Hamilton, directed the campaign, and it's from here that the successful evacuation was planned and overseen by his successor, Lieutenant General Birdwood. The headquarters comprised a number of tents, a signalling station, roads connecting them to the piers and other military establishments around the bay. One Australian who visited the headquarters in Imbros, the 11th Battalion's 37-year-old Lance Corporal William Hastings from Perth, described the headquarters as a small township. It was the site of many military conferences and was guarded by a small military formation formed by troops in the peninsula on a rotation basis, some of which were Australian. Between September and October 1915, soldiers of the Australian 12th and 26th Battalions formed the guard here at the headquarters in Imbros. The increasing casualties of the campaign saw Imbros become a major transportation hub for the thousands of wounded and sick soldiers brought to the island for treatment or onward transportation. Hospital ships and transports would be anchored in Cephalus and Leaky Bays, patients being transferred ashore or sailing onward for treatment further afield. Onshore military medical service to Imbros began operation at Cephalus in June and can be seen in the foreground of this photograph. While its patients were meant to be drawn from those based on Imbros, during August it had to cater for thousands of wounded brought from the battlefields of Gallipoli. Most were held for only short periods, but the lack of available transport soon saw the hospital overwhelmed. In one early August week, almost 13,000 patients were received at Imbros, those with light wounds being treated on the island, others being transported onwards. The development of Lemnos as the main advanced medical base for the campaign saw the onshore medical facilities at Imbros revert to being the camp hospital for the troops based on the island and those brought there for temporary rest, many of whom suffered from the intestinal and other diseases prevalent among the troops on the peninsula. A number of Australian soldiers are recorded as having been treated here, including Trooper Walter West of the 10th Light Horse Regiment, an English-born labourer from Liverpool in New South Wales. One of the most significant Australian connections to Imbros was the establishment of the Australian Field Bakery on the shores of Cephalus Bay. This brought over 90 Australian soldiers, many of them drawn from the baking trade, led by 38-year-old former Adelaide Cafe manager Captain John Pryor. The Bakers included 23-year-old West Melbourne-born Private Harold Wilkinson and 22-year-old Yass-born Private Valentine Crew, both of whom were Bakers prior to enlisting. The Bakers were brought to Imbros in May to provide fresh bread to the troops at Gallipoli to supplement their rations. They would stay on Imbros until the end of the campaign. The operation of the bakery is depicted in many photographs, the use of field ovens clearly revealed. By August, the Australian bakers were given command of 6 other British field bakeries, and the combined force would supply 60,000 daily rations of bread to the troops on the peninsula. The Australian Charles Bean described their having achieved this despite working under great stress, exposed as they were to sand and wind as well as disease. The bakers were also subject to enemy fire as they transported their bread to the piers at Gallipoli. Imbros was the location of a series of military rest camps for troops following the initial landings on the peninsula in April. The development and use of camps followed the development of the campaign itself. Thousands of Allied soldiers, including many Australian troops, came to Imbros as military camps for greater or lesser periods as they made their way to and from the fronts at the peninsula. They would come to these camps for short periods of rest after service in the trenches, assemble here in preparation for the deployment to the peninsula in the days before the August offensives, and return to them following their evacuation from the peninsula at the end of the campaign. The original campaign maps and archival photographs reveal these camps to have been mostly located within the valleys of Imbros's hinterland that faced onto Cephalus Bay, which was sometimes referred to as the Tuzla campsite. The camps can be seen nestling in the foothills of these valleys in various photographs. Australian troops came here along with the other Allied troops. In late June and early July, various Australian troops were brought to these camps for a few days' rest, marching the kilometre from their pier to the campsite. The 10th Battalion's medical officer, 26-year-old Captain Harry Knott from Adelaide, would describe his time on Imbros as a perfect holiday picnic and be photographed during his stay. Another was the 14th Battalion's 22-year-old Private William Marshall from Moonee Ponds, who's described his short rest on Imbros as, quote, a holiday trip from the trenches. In the days prior to the August offensives, nearly 14,000 men of the British 11th Division, along with Australian naval engineers of the Royal Australian Naval Bridging Train, would assemble and camp here before departing for the peninsula. While there, the troops would continue their training and maybe enjoy some recreation, including swimming in Cephalus Bay. One of the Australian naval engineers who came ashore was a 23-year-old able seaman, Laurie Smee from Victor Harbour in South Australia, who noted his arrival in his diary and went on to describe these activities in Imbros. To these would be added internment camps, one for the Ottoman prisoners captured on the peninsula and another apparently for Greek internees. The latter the result of Greece's neutrality and spy scares that gripped the Allied intelligence services. A number of photographs survive of these camps and the Ottoman prisoners on Imbros. Another significant and little appreciated Australian presence on Imbros was that of the Australian correspondents. The Australian correspondents. Australia's official war correspondent, Charles Bean, and Philip Schuller from Melbourne's Age newspaper were based here along with a number of other Allied media representatives. Australian newspaper proprietor Keith Murdoch would also come briefly to Imbros as a representative of the Australian government. Initially accommodated and attended camp at Cephalus, the correspondents would move to a rented house located nearby, which they would rename the Villa Pericles. In making this reference, clearly the correspondents were combining the classical elements of their education with recognition of the Hellenic history of the island and its people. Conditions at the camp were vastly different from those endured by the soldiers on the peninsula. Charles Bean referring once to having, quote, a jolly good dinner with champagne. An Australian soldier convalescing on Imbros at the time noted in a letter home that the house was the only two-storey house in the vicinity, referring to it as the chateau of the village. Australians would read many of the accounts of the campaign, of the struggles of their loved ones, in newspaper stories that had been written on Imbros at this camp. It was also here that the famous Anzac book, which was published in 1916 and a bestseller throughout Australia, was compiled by Charles Bean and his assistants from writings and illustrations supplied by the troops on the peninsula themselves. The Allied presence on Imbros during the Gallipoli campaign brought the new technology of air warfare to the island. Aircraft flew across the battlefronts from their bases at Imbros. An aircraft carrier, new balloon ships, and even an airship would come to Kefaloss as part of this effort. By the end of July, Imbros was the main Allied base for the campaign, their presence providing essential support to Allied ground and naval forces from before the landings in August to the evacuation of the peninsula. The first Air Force presence on the island came from the arrival at Kefaloss Bay in May of the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, HMS Ark Royal. Operating as a depot and repair ship for all the aircraft that would come to Imbros, she would be anchored in the bay until her departure in November. Her 10 seaplanes would operate from Kefaloss Bay, as well as from a base created between the sandbar and the Salt Lake at Aliki Bay, returning to the mothership for repairs and resupply. Her seaplanes conducted reconnaissance missions over Gallipoli, identifying and photographing enemy dispositions and potential targets. 3 more seaplane carriers are operated from Imbros for periods of time, faster than HMS Ark Royal, although operating a smaller number of seaplanes. These carriers could deploy their aircraft close to the peninsula. The first aerial launch of a torpedo was conducted in August by a seaplane from one of these carriers. 2 land-based aircraft bases were soon established around Kefaloss Bay for units of the Royal Naval Air Service. The No. 3 wing arrived at Imbros from Tenedos in early August, followed by the No. 2 wing arriving later in the same month. This brought some 60 aircraft to the island, although no more than between 25 to 30 were ever available at any one time. 2 Australians served with these air wings, 25-year-old Benalla-born Sergeant Cuthbert Lamrock of the 6th Light Horse Regiment, serving as an observer, and 22-year-old Sydney-born Flight Sub-Lieutenant Cecil Brimsmed, serving as a pilot. 3 kite balloon deploying ships also operated from Kefaloss Bay. These ships sailed from the bay to deploy their tethered observation kite balloons nearer to the front on the peninsula. To these were attached a cradle from which observers would communicate enemy target locations to warships off the peninsula, directing their naval fire. A self-powered, large cigar-shaped, hydrogen-filled airship, dubbed the Silver Queen or Silver Baby due to her colour, was also based at Kefaloss from August until October. Its distinctive green canvas-covered hangar and hydrogen supply base can be seen in a number of photographs and artworks. The airship's effectiveness was underscored by the enemy bombing of its base, after which it was relocated to Lemnos. Indeed, the Allied base in Imbros was subject to regular enemy air attacks, with reports of bombings taking place between May and December, the base being defended by the anti-aircraft guns of HMS Ark Royal anchored in Kefaloss Bay. Though little damage was caused, at least 2 persons were killed, including an Ottoman prisoner. The final evacuations from the Gallipoli Peninsula would see Kefaloss home to the evacuation fleet. The first evacuations from Anzac and Suvla were completed by the 19th of December, the second from Cape Helles in early January. As the troops arrived at Imbros for a short period of rest, the camps surrounding Kefaloss Bay and its surrounding valleys would fill up again. Some 14,000 troops arrived, mostly British troops from the northern Suvla front of the peninsula, including the 29th Division. Nearly 800 Australians came to Imbros during the evacuation from Anzac, the overwhelming majority of troops from Anzac having been evacuated to Lemnos. After being based at the camp for a few days or weeks, the troops were soon on their way again to Egypt. The photograph shown here captures the final departure from Imbros of Charles Bean and his media staff. Those who were wounded or sick were transported to military medical facilities at Egypt, Malta or England. With the evacuations complete and the troops departing, the rest camps at Imbros were closed and surplus equipment destroyed. Imbros's role in the Gallipoli campaign had come to a close, although its involvement in the war would continue until the end of the war with the signing of the armistice at Lemnos in October 1918. Across the period of the Allied presence on the island during the war, 3 locations were used for military burials. By the end of the war, these would contain the remains of over 140 military personnel. The main military cemetery established by the Allies on Imbros during the Gallipoli campaign was the Kefaloss British Cemetery, located to the north of the Allied camp at Kefaloss Bay. By the end of the war, 84 British, Australian and New Zealand service personnel, 3 Greeks and 1 German prisoner were buried here. Photographs reproduced in the exhibition, taken by British Petty Officer Bill Pollard, not only depict the cemetery and its graves, but also a burial party, that for 2 airmen, which took place on the 26th of November 1915. At least 2 Australians can be identified as having been buried here. One is the 14th Battalion's 22-year-old Yarraville-born Private Claude Coleman, an unmarried labourer living in Newport when he enlisted in September 1914. He died on the 1st of November from wounds sustained on the peninsula, passing away as he was being transported to Imbros. The other is 22-year-old Sydney-born Flight Sub-Lieutenant Cecil Brimsmead of the Royal Naval Air Services No. 3 Wing based on Imbros. Cecil was killed in action in a dogfight with an enemy airplane on the 11th of January 1916. His body and that of his fellow aviator being retrieved from the sea off Gallipoli and brought to Imbros for burial. This Australian is said to be the last Allied serviceman killed during the Gallipoli campaign. The other locations where Allied military personnel were buried in Imbros were the Kusu Bay Military Cemetery, established in 1918, and the Panayia Orthodox Church Cemetery, where 10 British personnel were buried, including Royal Navy Lieutenant Charles Devine, whose parents lived in Sydney. It is likely that there may have also been a Muslim cemetery on Imbros for the burial of Ottoman prisoners who died during the Gallipoli campaign. After the end of the war, these Allied military burials in Imbros were removed and reinterred at the Lancashire Landing Cemetery on the peninsula. As I've tried to explain, Imbros was transformed by the Allied presence on the island into an essential military and naval base for the Gallipoli campaign. However, for me, as a social historian, I'm particularly interested in how this role brought peoples together, Australians and other Allied personnel, with the local islanders, and how this is reflected in their experiences, their writings, their photographs and their artworks. Imbros's role in the campaign obviously impacted on the Hellenic population of the island. The creation of the Allied base around Kephalos no doubt disrupted the ordinary rhythms of life of the islanders. And over the weeks and months of their presence on the island, the new arrivals would travel across the island, experiencing its natural environment, visiting its villages and enjoying its hospitality. No doubt the first encounters occurred in and around Kephalos Bay, most likely as the locals offered the island's produce and other goods for sale to the soldiers and sailors as they arrived at Imbros. Accounts tell of local traders sailing their way out to their colourful kaiki boats to the Allied ships anchored in the bay, offering their goods to their eager new customers. One soldier wrote of the beautiful green and blue boats with coloured oars and white sails, offering egg, fruit and fish. The British Royal Navy officer and artist, Norman Wilkinson, depicted these local fishing vessels at Imbros in a series of drawings and watercolours, some of which can be seen here. Other locals offered their produce for sale on the beaches as the soldiers and sailors came ashore, some setting up little temporary booths on the tracks leading from the bay to the Allied camps. These booths are reported to have offered a whole range of goods, from fruit and desserts to tin goods, even cigarettes and local cognac. A photograph shows one of these booths proudly flying the Greek flag as customers crowd around its wares. Some soldiers were able to purchase and enjoy their first taste of yoghurt during their stay on the island, described by the British intelligence officer Compton Mackenzie as, quote, life-giving stuff, and as a food that must have been invented by the gods themselves when compared to his army rations. The Allied camps were also locations for interaction. One photograph depicts a Greek Orthodox priest from the town of Panayia, some 12 miles distant, surrounded by Allied airmen as he blessed them and their new aerodrome at Kephalos. Another in the exhibition shows 2 soldiers meeting a local family near the camps. A number of locals were no doubt also engaged by the Allies in the construction of the base itself. Some 2,000 Hellenes were recruited to assist the Allies as a labour force during the campaign. The work of these labourers on Imbros has been captured in photographs. Second Lieutenant Taylor writes in his battalion war diary in July of seeing Greek labourers on Imbros blasting rocks to create a landing and make roads. Soon the new arrivals were hiring local donkeys and guides to traverse the island to enjoy its natural environment and visit some of its main villages, such as Panayia and Castro on the north coast. These included the Australians Charles Bean and Lieutenant Alfred Shout, the latter being photographed with a group of his comrades as they set out on their ride across Imbros, pictured here. One British soldier, Captain John Gillam, recorded his ride across the island, noting the hills covered in thick green gorse and rocks, with sheep, cows and bullocks grazing nearby. The wooded valleys were dotted with groves of olive and fig trees. As they passed vineyards growing luscious dark grapes, he wrote that the locals offered some to the soldiers, and every now and then a glimpse of the blue Aegean could be seen. Australian Private William Marshall wrote home in July of Imbros's beautiful scenery, the crystal clear stream water, the wild thyme and coloured flowers growing in abundance. He also noted the work of the islanders at harvest, the threshing and milling of the golden grain, using the power of the windmills that stood on hilltops, including one he visited that stood above the camps at Kephalos Bay, meeting the old miller and his wife. This windmill is seen here in the photograph by Petty Officer Bill Pollard, with one of the Allied aerodromes in the distance. Recently I was able to discover, with the aid of another Australian researcher of Imbrian heritage, the name of the owner of this windmill, one Thanasis Epistolos. 29-year-old Sergeant Parry from Mooney Ponds, attached to the Anzac headquarters, went up into the mountain to gaze out on the waters of the Aegean, the scene captured in a photograph. Another British soldier, Lieutenant Charles Lister, wrote of the oleander and mulberry trees of the island as he rode by. He went on to write that Imbros was a land of plenty, a dream island. No doubt for many of these soldiers, their time on Imbros was a welcome respite from the horrors of war. Many also recorded their visits to local Greek Orthodox establishments. Charles Lister wrote of visiting a number of churches, including one crowning the top of the highest mountain on the island. Lance Corporal William Hastings wrote home of visiting a local chapel in the hills above Kephalos Bay and being moved to leave a note with a donation. A number of these local churches and religious shrines can be found in some of the artworks reproduced in the exhibition. The one shown here are by the New Zealand-born sapper Horace Moore-Jones. The larger villages on Imbros provided more opportunities to meet the locals. Charles Bean rode as far as Panaya, walking its streets and enjoying its hospitality. Lieutenant Charles Lister described the town as, quote, a charming village, where he gorged on fresh vegetables excellently cooked by a handy Greek. Second Lieutenant Theodore Taylor described the town as remarkably clean, with houses built of stone and wood, with terracotta roofs and plenty of children. There was a post office here, its windows decorated with flowers, where stamps could be bought, operated by an obliging young local. He also refers to the existence of a telephone line connecting Kephalos with Castro, which may well have connected to Panaya given its location between the two. Panaya was also the home to a two-storey inn, where accommodation and refreshments could be had. According to Captain John Gillam, the inn had been recently renamed the Gran Bretagna Hotel by its enterprising local owner, no doubt in a successful attempt to attract visitors. Gillam stayed overnight on one occasion, but also visited a few other times, stopping to enjoy its hospitality, describing a meal of partridge, omelettes and honey, all washed down by some German beer. Photographs from such urban centres confirm these impressions, with large two-storey buildings, glass windows and shop signs, showing Allied soldiers with local residents. This photograph, taken by the 6th Battalion's 19-year-old Private John Rogers from Wonthaggi in January 1916, shows Allied soldiers joining in a dance with local children. In a not dissimilar scene, Captain John Gillam wrote of joining in the annual celebrations of a local holiday at an unnamed village, with bands playing and people dancing, villagers going house to house, enjoying the refreshments of cake, jelly, melon, grapes, figs, wine and liqueurs, and the visiting soldiers being invited to join in. Some travelled as far as Castro, visiting its harbour and village. The correspondent Philip Schuller took a photograph on his visit there, with its Greek Orthodox church and Greek flag clearly visible. Second Lieutenant Theodore Taylor noted that this was the chief seaport of Imbros, with many fishing boats in its harbour. Captain John Gillam had lunch here in September, describing the tiny little harbour with its fishing boats and fishermen's huts. On the cliffs above the village, he enjoyed a delightful sleep. followed by a swim in the beautiful, clear, warm water with no rocks. A local fisherman returning to the harbour in his boat reminded Gillam of the return of Ulysses. The whole scene, with the cloudless sky and the sun falling on distant Samothrace, which has not changed for 1,000 years, led Gillam to muse on the ancient history of the region. And above this village stood the ruins of the Byzantine-era castle from which the town derived its name. Henry Nevinson wrote of how in its crumbling walls could be seen slabs of white marble, remnants of some Greek temple, which can still be seen today. Philip Schuller walked among the ruins, capturing his experience in vivid photographs. Some Allied soldiers were able to converse with the locals. The Royal Navy Division's officer Patrick Shaw Stewart did so, writing home in July of successfully conversing with some locals using the ancient Greek he had learnt during his education. On the island for a few days, he wrote that here on Imbros he was, quote, living in a Greek village, speaking the language of Demosthenes to its inhabitants. It was while on Imbros that he would also write one of the most famous poems of the First World War, entitled Achilles in the Trench, the poem ending with a soldier returning to Gallipoli, quote, from Imbros over the sea, from which I have taken the title of this exhibition in the book. The poem is full of the soldier's dread of the return to battle and of the hope that the spirit of Achilles will be with him. These written and photographic legacies of the Allied presence on Imbros are evidence of the close contact that occurred between these two communities. Australians met the Hellenes of Imbros at their Allied camps as they traversed the island and in the villages and towns. While the Gallipoli campaign brought nothing but war and destruction to the northern Aegean, this interaction was one of the few positive benefits of the campaign. After the end of the campaign, Imbros remained an Allied military base, battleships patrolling the waters of the northern Aegean and airplanes flying overhead. As the First World War drew to a close, Imbros would witness a major naval engagement in the waters off Kusu Bay. 2 Allied naval vessels would be sunk in the dead period in Imbros. The end of the war brought a temporary return to peace and normality for Imbros and its people. However, the subsequent Greco-Turkish War and its outcome would have a dramatic effect on the island. While the Hellenes of Imbros, along with those of Tenedos and Constantinople, would be exempt from the terms of the population exchange of 1922, the surrender of Imbros to the new Turkish nation would bring new challenges. They may not have been subjected to the immediate uprooting and forced removal from their homeland as their co-religionists across Asia Minor, but the years ahead would see the Hellenic population fall, a reduction encouraged by the Turkish government policies of the day, until it would be less than 300 residents. In recent years, the Greek Orthodox population of the island has increased, with more than 600 living in Imbros today. In Australia, the memory of Imbros and Gallipoli remains in the few street names that dot the country, including these in Brisbane and Melbourne. It remains in the archives of the Australian War Memorial and the National Library of Australia, and it remains in the hearts of the many Imbrians who have made Australia their new home. These few slides show Imbros and some of the locations visited by the Anzacs and other Allied troops as they are today. I have walked the island in search of reminders of the time when Imbros played its vital role in the Gallipoli campaign. While there are a few physical remains, thankfully the lack of overdevelopment allows one to imagine the outline of those days. Across Gallipoli Bay and the surrounding hinterland, the Allied base can be easily plotted. And the Byzantine ruins of Castro, modern-day Kalakoy, with distant Samothrace clearly in sight, can be where the Australian war correspondents walked, remain untouched. I can highly recommend a visit to the island and its welcoming people. It is a dream of many of us that an Imbros Remembrance Trail should be created, with markers identifying the key sites connecting the island to this important era in history, telling the story of how the island and its people were impacted by the war. Many of us have lobbied and worked to create such a trail on nearby Lemnos. It was my privilege to have been engaged as the historical consultant for this major Australian government project and we're slowly seeing it take place. A similar trail could be easily installed on Imbros with Australian and Turkish government support. This would not only commemorate those who served there, but be a great boost to the economy of the island, benefiting all who live there, including its remaining Greek Orthodox population. A recent Turkish tourism study stated that an estimated 200,000 visitors come to Gallipoli every year, prompting initiatives to develop new commemorative tourism opportunities. I strongly believe that Imbros could be part of such an initiative. We hope that the continuing display of our exhibition and the sales of the book will assist us in spreading this important story and maybe even making the trail a reality. Some might ask, why does it matter? Why should we remember Imbros and its part in the Gallipoli story? As a historian, I believe that it is a story that should be told as an integral part of the wider Gallipoli story, but it should also be remembered for the story it tells of the island and its islanders themselves, captured in a moment in time. This small period in the island's history enabled its life to be documented by these inquisitive visitors from across the world, ensuring that Imbros and its life would find a place in the archives across the world. In conclusion, can I first thank Melbourne's Imbrian Society for encouraging my journey and my work, especially Project Officer George Zenos and Carla Fiati, who's here. I hope you can say hello to those of Imbrian descent that are here. They're lovely people. Secondly, I thank the Victorian Government and Veterans Council and the various other individual donors mentioned earlier, without whose support this exhibition could not have been put together. Thirdly, and in many ways most importantly, can I thank all the archives which have shared their material with me, and now you, to help tell the story. Along with all the public archives in Australia and the United Kingdom, I'd particularly like to thank the First World War Aviation Society in London, as well as veterans' families such as Ms. Anne Holland, the granddaughter of Sapper Alec Holland, who came to Imbros as an Anzac in 1915, for sharing their collections with us. My work would have been so much the poorer without it. And finally, thank you to the Greek community of Melbourne for encouraging us to deliver this presentation and for displaying the exhibition over the coming weekend. By your support, you have helped us, and especially Melbourne's Imbrian Society, to keep this important but little-known story of their island alive. I hope you enjoy my presentation and will come to see the exhibition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for another sort of fascinating presentation. The good thing about having the mic is you can kickstart off the questioning, and I do have a few questions for you. You also did mention that the Allies also occupied Tenedos. Is that the next research project?
I would like to do that. That would be another story. It's not really an Australian story, though. I fear it's more a naval story.
A British story.
But I have visited Tenedos. It's an interesting little island, and it did have a part. So maybe it's a trilogy.
And I presume there's no airport today at Imbros. So how do people get there from the?
If you want to travel to Imbros and Tenedos, you have to go via Istanbul. And I think there are buses that go all the way to Imbros. But basically you make your way to
they go on the ferry.
The Gallipoli Peninsula, then there's a ferry. With Tenedos you have to cross over to Çanakkale, go further south, and then you go to Tenedos from there. There are ports. But it's very accessible, some great accommodation. One of the best hotels I've stayed in the region is on Imbros. It's a sort of eco hotel that I just come across. I didn't know anyone there. Owned by a Greek and a Turkish sort of couple, and it's a beautiful hotel. I can highly recommend it. So I just to stress, I don't speak Greek, I don't speak Turkish. I turned up there without any contacts, and I was really made welcome. So if I can be made welcome, I'm sure that you here could be made welcome. So.
One of the photographs that fascinated me were the airships. How did they get the hydrogen? Was it just transported on ships or to?
The big
the airships. Yeah.
I don't know how they got it there, but I assume it must have been transported, either deflated and then they inflated it with the hydrogen. But they were very dangerous because it was totally flammable. I mean, you wonder why they want to use it in a wartime.
Yeah.
Because as I was saying, it was mainly German planes, were dropping bombs and firing and stuff like that. So that's why they moved it to to Lemnos, but they flew it over the peninsula, which is sort of pretty dangerous. But I don't know exactly how that was transported there. But there were lots of photos of it. A lot of people talked about it. It was referred to the silver baby, the silver, it looked like a cigar, all sort of stuff. But there were, yeah. So, but they took lots of photographs. That's the fellow Pollard, the one that I mentioned before, who I was able to get the photographs from the First World War Aviation Society in London. They generously shared them with me. He took hundreds of photographs of northern Greece, the Gallipoli Peninsula, Chios, Lesbos, pictures of, so all these airships are really important. They all had to have photographers on them or radio and stuff. So.
Yeah. And what struck me about a lot of the slides that it didn't seem seemed quite an arid, not a very fertile island and so forth. So the Immigrants have always had a tradition of migration as well. When did the population peak in Imbros? Do you have any idea in your?
I mean, it was during the Gallipoli campaign. I can't remember. I think it was about 10,000. Yeah. And the Greek part of it was like 98%, like the Hellenic part of it was really quite dominant, and that's from both Ottoman census sources and the Allied soldiers there. It looks arid, but what happens if you went to Lemnos in summer? Things get burnt, but then if you go there in spring, suddenly it's full of flowers and stuff. So it depends on the season where you go. I think too with Imbros there's a lot of valleys and a lot of fruit trees. They must have had less goats than on Lemnos, because Lemnos has a problem with having too many goats, so it eats all the trees. But apart from those valleys where Asia Minor refugees went to, they put fences around them to keep the goats out. But obviously at the time it was very luscious. There was fruit, vineyards, and it is a very big island. I mean, it's not. Tenedos is quite small. Imbros, you can travel around in the car. There's lots to see, and it's very, the hills very high up and all that sort of stuff. So it's a rich place. It's not. I know what you mean about some of the scenes are in. They must have been taken in summer. They're quite burnt, rocky. But it's not that. The photos that are showed of Imbros
towards the end are a bit more lush.
I mean, they're sort of. It's really sunny. It's sort of. It's beautiful.
Okay. Thank you.
And people go there for windsurfing and from all over Europe because of the wind from the Dardanelles. So.
Okay, I'll stop monopolising the questions. Any questions from the floor?
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Jimmy, or Zimmy. Another fantastic presentation, my friend. Nick stole one of the questions. I was curious about the population of the island at the time your research took place. And so you were saying about 9 or 10,000 and down to almost, only 10% of that now? Is that correct?
No, it'd be probably, I don't know the exact population is now, but in terms of the Hellenic population, it's about 600.
Yeah.
That's the last figure that we've heard. When I was there in 2015, it was 300.
No worries. And I've just got a couple more quick ones, if I may. I'll do a Nick. I'll try to shove a couple in there. With your significant research into both Lemnos and Imbros, what was the logistical bifurcation with the Allies? How did they split the responsibilities of each island?
I mean, basically, Lemnos had the biggest protected harbour in the eastern Aegean, so that they could have 100 warships, and they had sort of anti-submarine nets. With Imbros, obviously it's important because it was closer to Gallipoli, so people would use it as a transportation hub. They come quickly and then they go. They wouldn't necessarily, there'd be a number of ships were anchored there, like the Ark Royal, but it wasn't big enough or protected enough because it's got quite. If you look at the maps, it's quite an open front. But they sunk battleships, which they refloated and used again. But they sunk some battleships, old battleships, and then they put anti-submarine nets. So but it was basically like, because it was closer to Gallipoli and closer to Suvla Bay and closer to Anzac. Right. So it was like a smaller ships, tugboats, stuff would come backwards and forwards, they go there. But Lemnos was a more permanent base, hospital ships and all sorts of stuff, because it had this very narrow opening at the front and they had 2 gates on it. So because there were German submarines sinking ships sort of going to and fro.
Gotcha. And just one quick final one, if that's all right. As a social historian, I'm just curious about, you told us that touching tale of an Aussie experimenting with yogurt for the first time and realising it was the food of the gods.
Scottish, actually. Yeah.
Was there much by way of cultural influence leaking back to Australia?
The thing we don't know, I mean, the thing is, I just think it was important enough for these people to write about it. So they wrote about it in letters home, which are then published in newspapers, because their relatives would send them newspapers. Or they write about it in memoirs. It's such a tiny thing, but it's important enough for them to put it in. So the yogurt story is in a large book about, you know, the intelligence services during Gallipoli and, you know, finding spies and that. And then suddenly he just breaks into this social thing about, you know, having yogurt. He's got a terrible upset stomach. He sees a guy with yogurt. Guy's secretive. He's another soldier. He's bought yogurt from some local supplier. He doesn't want to tell anyone else where he buys it from because he's worried everyone's going to buy it. There's going to be no yogurt left. But he manages to sort of get the guy to give him some, and he describes how, you know, it fixes up his stomach, and it's really, you know, made by the god, you know, made by the gods, you know, life-giving stuff. Which that's the first, and he's got a funny way of spelling yogurt, but it's the first time I've seen a reference to it in an English book, and yeah. So what the thing that we don't have, and this thing is that we don't know, these islands were on the periphery of the Ottoman Empire. I think there obviously were, you know, telephone line, postal service. So there's obviously people who could write, and there's obviously a part of the population would have been literate, but probably the majority of the population probably less literate, you know, Lemnos too. So we don't, you know, I think sadly we've probably missed an opportunity to find out the oral history, you know, of memories of that. I know that on Lemnos, when I've talked to people, when you hear a family story, it confuses World War I and World War II, so it's a bit dangerous, you know, because you don't know, are they referring to that period, you know, so, because, yeah, so it's a real pity because it's really the Australian or British soldiers' view of Greece. But within that, it's really touching. They're not patronising, they're not sort of, who are these, you know, people? The funny thing you find is when you find a soldier who comes from a rural area and he's a farmer and he starts commenting on the farming techniques. But he's not saying, he said, oh, they're using the old way of doing this, you know, we would do this. Or they might say, the women do all the work, the men do nothing, you know. It's the women in the field, they're collecting all the stuff, the guy's having a cigarette, you know. They get all this sort of commentary, which, you know, you go on with. They're beautiful social vignettes when you come across them. I mentioned the story of this Theodore Taylor. He's a really interesting, so there's a, you know, like a 600-page war diary from Gallipoli, and within that, even if he goes to Lemnos, he goes to Imbros, so it's mostly the normal stuff about a war diary. He's recording number of soldiers, engagements, who's sick, who's winning. But when he goes to the islands, he suddenly stops. And you know, I was just going through this diary looking for other things. This is a couple of years ago. Suddenly he stops, says, I arrive on Imbros, you know, and he just starts describing the island. You know, the population is so-and-so, this village is, you know, I went to this village, this is so many Greeks, so many Turks, the buildings are such and such. You know, he just launches into this social commentary, which is totally unusual. So he did that for Lemnos, did it for Imbros. Why did he do that? Why did he do it? You know, like in the middle of he doesn't do it for Egypt. So obviously has some affinity, you know. He's some sort of, I think it may be what it was they're going from the peninsula, where it's just unremitting, and there's battles, you know, sickness, all this stuff. Then they go away for a few weeks. Suddenly they're on an island. There's no shelling or anything. It's quiet, and after a few days, he starts to sort of return to normality. So, yeah, it's fascinating.
Question by John. No chemistry questions, John.
Yeah, I know. You took my main question. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Jim, for the lecture. Now, I'm interested in what was the attitude of the local residents, both ethnic Turks and ethnic Greeks, towards this campaign, the Gallipoli campaign as such. Did that take sides, or were they even aware of what was going on, or what was their attitude, if that was possible?
You know, the government was, the government started, as I said before, the government of Venizelos was very pro-Ally, but then he fell, and the king was more neutral, some say pro-German, so it was sort of, then there was a civil war in Greece, civil war in the First Civil War. People think of the Second Civil War. There was the First Civil War where they were fighting, the army split in two. The second capital was on Syra. Admiral Contariotis was with Venizelos. So during that time, obviously people are not, the islands of Imbros and Lemnos just been joined to Greece. Then there's a split in the Greek government. So there was fighting around Athens, a lot of people were killed. So it didn't get resolved till late 1916, early 1917. So So I put that at the start. But despite that, a lot of Greeks did volunteer. They volunteered either on civilian ships. So I managed to find in the the National Archives the ship's log of one of these cable laying ships, and it has the people that's serving on it. And the great thing was it writes down their names, so it's a Greek name, Greek surname, and it has where he joined the ship. So he said he got on at Milos, or he got on at so-and-so. So I could work out what the proportion of the sailors on these ships were Greeks. They volunteered. I'll tell you, I digressed about that. Was that there's a famous, not famous, but I think it's famous. There's they're laying the cable, because the cables had to keep being replaced because Allied warships were going up and down Gallipoli, and they're dragging they put their anchor down and it would break the cable. So these cable ships got to go back and relay a telegraph cable. And they're right near the Gallipoli Peninsula, they're laying it, and they start getting, the Turks are firing at them. So the shells are getting closer and closer, and this British guy in the diary, he says, he turned around and there was one of the Greek seafarers, he's fishing. Right, so imagine it's a Gallipoli campaign, you're getting fired at from the peninsula, this guy's fishing up the thing, so he calls on him to get out of the way, and then as they sort of start to move off, this sailor gets hit by a splinter, but he grabs the fish, he's got the fish. So I mean, in the middle of war you get these sort of odd things. The guy survived, he didn't die. So there were Greeks on those ships, there were also Greeks that served as guides and translators with the Allied units on Gallipoli. There was 1,000 Asia Minor refugees who joined the French Foreign Legion. There's a special unit, and they served at Cape Helles. Now, I'm not sure whether they ever came to Imbros. I'm not sure if any Imbrians were in it, but certainly it was written about in the French archives. These were Asia Minor refugees who came, they joined up, and there's photographs of them at Gallipoli, photographs of them on Lemnos. There are also a number of, I don't know whether it's 200, 300, 400 Cretans. They never actually fought at Gallipoli. They did a diversionary attack. But the ones that were at at Gallipoli itself, the Asian Minor refugees, they were a terrible part of the front, and they went on to serve at the Sloga campaign. So, and as well as that, there were a whole lot of Greeks who worked as a labour corps. So they were building the piers, building the roads, all the central parts of the military. So there was a lot of engagement with the Allied forces, even though Greece itself was neutral for most of the time. There's I'll tell you a funny story about were they aware of things. So there's a family called the Vasilakis family, and how we know them is that they were arrested. Right? And what it was these were 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and they originally from Lesbos, and they 2 brothers went to America, made all this money, came back, and they wanted to establish they had this dream of establishing a hotel on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Right? But they obviously hadn't read the newspapers. They were sailing back. They get a ship. They buy a ship. They don't want to tell anyone about their plan because they're worried someone might steal their idea. And they sail across the Aegean. Of course, they're sailing across the Aegean. They're wondering what's going on. They're going to different islands, and the British intelligence think they're spies. They're sort of they're maybe recording ship movements. So they get arrested. And this guy, the yogurt man, he has to interrogate them, but he comes to the conclusion these people are just, they're just civilians who are lost and they're stupid. So, and the guy they resolve to go back to America. So there was sort of some, although there was a lot of communication, obviously some people didn't pay attention to it. But there's a whole chapter about these Vasilakis brothers, which are very funny in the book.
You already touched on the Asia Minor. Now, what I wanted to ask you, whether at that point of the catastrophe, were there any that did come to Imbros? Was there any, in other words, some of the Asia Minor refugees came across, and we know they came across the whole islands, but to your knowledge, would
I would doubt it, because what happens, because in 1922, Imbros and Tenedos and the Constantinople Greek population are exempted from the exchange, like the Muslims of Thrace. Right? So what happens is, if you were fleeing Asia Minor, you wouldn't have you couldn't have stayed in Imbros anyway, because the Turks would have expelled you. So no, they would have went to Chios and Lesbos and stuff, and then Lemnos, but not to Imbros.
So when were they?
Imbrians who went to Lemnos, Imbrians would have left, chosen to leave, because at the time, up between 1918 and 1922, there were Imbrian members of the Greek Parliament that elected representatives, because it was for 4 years it was part of Greece. And then you had the exchange, and you had the treaty, and the treaty was those. I mean, Turkey wanted more than Imbros and Tenedos, but they ended up, that was what they were given back.
Was the treaty in 23?
Yeah, 23.
Okay, so that's why I'm asking,
23
because I knew
last
it was a 23, but I
23,
thought maybe, okay, well,
Yeah,
they
so
got
it's-
wind of it before, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then slowly over the, it was overwhelmingly Greek, but then just over time, depended on events happening in Cyprus, depended on the nature of the Turkish government at the time. Sometimes things were, there were Imbrians here, they would know more than I would, but from what I have read and been told, sometimes it was more benign, but other times it was really horrible. There was an open prison established on the island, which sort of, so criminals wandering around, stealing things, breaking into houses. It's certainly a lot more benign now. So, and I actually think with the tourism opportunities, which would be great for the Greek population that are there, is to have Imbros included in the Gallipoli Trail, is that it would a boon for the economy and boon for everyone, but especially for the Greek community, because most of the villages where the Allied soldiers went were in where the Greek villages are. So.
Any further questions? Well, you've only got, I think, a quarter of the exhibition here. I'm sorry.
So, Jim, it's interesting what you said about the locals. My mother's side are from Imbros. My grandfather served for Greece like some other grandparents for Greece, but none of us know where they served or where they were.
Yeah.
My grandfather, I know, was at war for 7 years before he came back. From what we were told, the records were burnt in Lemnos because Imbros was, like Lemnos was its capital, so to speak.
Regional capital.
Is there anywhere where we can look up to find out where the actual locals of Imbros served? It bugs me because it was Greek. I'm not considered Greek in Greece, yet my grandfather served for the Greek military, so I can't get Greek citizenship.
I'm sure.
And it's like we've been told if we can find the records to prove that our grandparents were Greek, even though they all know, but we don't know any of the history of where they fought or if they fought or where they were for 7 years.
I think it's extremely possible that, people in Imbros, given the population size, that men served in the Greek army that fought in Asia Minor. It's extremely possible, but, I don't know, but it was the largest army that Greece put in the field. It was the army that invaded, went to Asia Minor. But I think it was there'll be other people who know more about that period than me, but I would assume there was so much political convulsions in Greece around the time, before, like talking about the First World War, but after the Asia Minor catastrophe, the convulsions in Greece, trials, the army, there was a revolt, the military took over, then there was, Venizelos came back. I'm sure that period there were records destroyed, or, you'd have to find like a military historian in Greece who knows to access these records. I don't know whether they exist. The fortunate thing we have for Australia and to the extent the UK is that you have these continuity of records. So apart from there were some, my grandfather served in the First World War, but what happened was in the Second World War they moved the army records out of London because they're worried they're going to get bombed, and where they put them they got bombed. So my grandfather's army records were burnt, so you do lose them. But in Australia we've got these great digitised records for all the soldiers, and the war diaries are all digitised. So you can actually identify, like for Lemnos and for Imbros, I'm able to look through all the units that went to Gallipoli. I can find out, and it has their daily diary, where they go. So it tells you where that's when I was saying, these two regiments provided the guard for the headquarters in Imbros. I know because it's got it in the diary. It says, 15 men led by Captain so-and-so were there for 6 weeks. So I know the guy's name, I know where he's from. So he was in Imbros for 6 weeks, and he was guarding the, then you got a photograph of them. But with Greek Army records, I think it's very difficult, during that period. If it was, and then you've got, of course, Second World War is a bit the same. You've got the disruption of the German occupation. You've got the Civil War. But I'm sure some do survive, and I'm sure there are probably historians who specialise in going through it. But yeah.
Can I just suggest something for the Imbrians? These days, it's a bit easier to access Ottoman archive records. Okay, and you could probably get records from the 15th or 16th century and identify family names, but you still need someone to sort of translate the records. So
I should say about that, what Nick was saying, to do with the Turkish or the Ottoman, the Ottoman archives for the First World War, military war diaries, which are just like the Australian war diaries or Greek ones. They've all been, not only have they been digitised, but they've been translated into English because a historian, that was during the centenary, a historian called Harvey Broadbent, who specialises in looking at the Turkish, defence, if you want a better word, of Gallipoli. That was one of his things, to raise money to have them all translated and digitised, because they're obviously, some of them are written in an old Ottoman script. They're very difficult to read. But supposedly he's an aficionado at this. So the Ottoman war diaries are available. If you know the units, you can find them. But but even further, there'll be family records and stuff. So anyway.
Okay. As I was about to say before, this is probably only a quarter of the exhibition. Is that right?
Yeah, this is
Jim?
only like 5. There's 21 panels.
21 panels.
Really recommend.
So the exhibition is on the weekend. 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Both Saturday and Sunday. So try and come along over the weekend. Okay. In this room, okay, at the mezzanine. Thanks once again. Let's put our hands together for Jim Claven for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I hope to see you on the weekend, and also next Thursday again with Nick Chikakis speaking on the poetry of Tassos Livadidis. Thank you.